He called her illiterate, and for a second, the room went quiet, then the laughter started. 10 seconds later, no one was laughing anymore. "You don't need to read to carry plates," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. The laughter that followed was soft, but sharp, like glass under a polished shoe. Sophie Bennett didn't flinch. Not immediately. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, the kind that made everything look more expensive than it was, crystal glasses catching reflections, silverware chiming softly against porcelain, conversations weaving together like a quiet symphony. It was the kind of place where people came to prove something. And tonight, Ethan Cole was proving he owned the room. Sophie stood beside the table, order pad in hand, her posture straight, her expression composed. Her black uniform was pressed, spotless, but the edges of her sleeves were slightly worn if you looked closely enough. Most people didn't. Most people saw what they expected to see. A waitress. Replaceable. Invisible. Ethan leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his tailored suit fitting him like it had been made for moments like this. Which, in a way, it had. Billionaire CEO. 34. The kind of man whose name carried weight in rooms he hadn't even entered yet. His eyes flicked up at her again, measuring, dismissive. "I asked for the Bordeaux," he continued, tapping the menu with 2 fingers. "Not the house red. It's not complicated." Sophie glanced down at the menu briefly, then back at him. "I understand, sir. I'll correct it right away." Her voice was calm. Neutral. Too calm for someone who had just been laughed at. That, more than anything, made him pause, just for a fraction of a second. Around the table, his business partners shifted, some amused, others watching more carefully now. One of them, a gray-haired man with a European accent, tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Sophie turned to leave, her steps measured, unhurried. But as she moved, the small notebook tucked into her apron brushed against her wrist. It was worn at the edges, filled with neat, handwritten lines, phrases, translations, fragments of something most people would never notice. She reached the service station, exhaling softly, just once. Not frustration. Not anger. Something quieter. Something held back. Behind her, the laughter at the table faded into low murmurs. Ethan watched her go, his gaze lingering longer than he expected. There was something off. Not wrong. Just not what he was used to. He had seen embarrassment before. Seen people shrink, stumble, apologize too quickly. She hadn't done any of that. She had simply absorbed it. Like it didn't define her. He picked up his glass, swirling the wine absent-mindedly. "New staff?" one of the partners asked. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Does it matter?" But even as he said it, his eyes drifted back toward the service area. Sophie was speaking quietly with another server now, her fingers tracing something on the edge of her notebook, her lips moving as if repeating a phrase under her breath. Not rehearsing. Refining. The gray-haired man at the table leaned forward slightly. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "sometimes the quiet ones are the most interesting." Ethan gave a faint, dismissive smile. "Or the most forgettable." But the words didn't land the way they usually did. Because for the first time that night, he wasn't entirely sure which one she was. And across the room, Sophie closed her notebook gently, as if sealing something away, not out of fear, but patience. As if she already knew that moments like this had a way of coming back around. The minutes stretched just enough for the tension to settle into the room, not disappear, just soften at the edges like heat rising off polished wood. Sophie returned with the Bordeaux, the correct bottle this time, her movements precise, unhurried, as if nothing had happened at all. She set the bottle down gently, label facing outward, exactly the way she had been trained. Ethan watched her again, more carefully now. There was no rush in her hands, no nervous tremor, no attempt to overcompensate. It was not confidence in the loud sense. It was something quieter. Something that did not ask for permission. "Would you like me to open it here, sir?" she asked. "Or would you prefer to inspect the cork first?" The phrasing made one of the guests glance up sharply. Ethan noticed. He tilted his head slightly. "You can open it," he said, his tone neutral now, but edged with curiosity. Sophie nodded once. As she began, her fingers moved with practiced ease, cutting the foil cleanly, extracting the cork in one smooth motion without a sound. No pop. Just control. The gray-haired man leaned forward again, studying her. Your accent, he said suddenly, his voice carrying a soft European lilt. Where are you from? Sophie looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I grew up in Chicago, sir. And you're French? He pressed, gesturing lightly toward the bottle. You pronounced Bordeaux perfectly. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise. Not discomfort. Recognition. Thank you, she said simply. Ethan's fingers stilled around his glass. He had not expected that. He leaned forward slightly now, resting his elbows on the table. So you do read, he said, a faint edge returning to his voice, though softer than before. A little more than expected. A few guests shifted, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Sophie placed the cork on the small dish, then began to pour, starting with the host, exactly as etiquette required. When she reached Ethan, she paused just slightly, just enough to be noticeable if someone was paying attention. Enough? She asked. He held her gaze this time. That depends, he said. Can you tell me if it is worth the price? There it was. Another test. This one quieter, but sharper. The kind that did not rely on volume, but precision. Sophie glanced at the wine in his glass, then back at him. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the bottle just enough to read the vintage again, her eyes scanning quickly, almost absent-mindedly. Then she spoke. It is a 2012 St. Julian, she said calmly. Balanced tannins, medium body. It holds its structure well, but it is not meant to impress. It is meant to last. Silence settled over the table again, heavier this time. One of the guests let out a soft, almost involuntary breath. Ethan did not move. And is it worth it? He asked again, quieter now. Sophie gave the smallest hint of a smile. That depends on what you are trying to prove, she said. The words landed gently. But they stayed. The gray-haired man leaned back slowly, clearly impressed now, while another guest gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. Well, he murmured, that answers more than the wine. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a sound that could have been amusement or something else entirely. He looked at her differently now. Not as a distraction. Not as background. But not fully understood either. Sophie finished pouring the last glass, then stepped back, her posture unchanged. Please let me know if you need anything else, she said. And then she turned to leave. But this time, Ethan's voice followed her. Wait. It was not loud. It did not need to be. She paused. Just for a second. Then she turned back, meeting his eyes again. And for the first time that night, there was no dismissal in his gaze. Only curiosity. And something else beginning to form beneath it. The room held its breath in a way that no one could quite explain, as if something invisible had shifted and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Sophie stood still, her tray balanced lightly against her fingertips, her expression calm but attentive. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, the faintest trace of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Where did you learn that? He asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. It was not a challenge this time. It was a question. Sophie did not answer right away. She glanced briefly at the table, at the glasses, at the quiet curiosity written across the faces of people who had moments ago been ready to dismiss her entirely. Then she looked back at him. From listening, she said simply. A soft murmur moved through the table, subtle but unmistakable. The gray-haired man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head with something that resembled admiration. That is not something you learn from listening alone, he said. Not like that. Sophie offered a small, polite smile, the kind that acknowledged the comment without inviting further questions. You would be surprised what people reveal when they assume you are not paying attention, she replied. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Slightly. There it was again. That quiet precision. He tapped his finger once against the rim of his glass, thoughtful now. And what do you hear when you listen to us? He asked. It could have sounded like a trap. But there was no hostility in it anymore. Only curiosity, edged with something he had not expected to feel tonight. Respect, perhaps. Sophie hesitated for the first time. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding whether to give it. The pause stretched just long enough to make the moment feel deliberate. Then she spoke. "I hear people who are used to being heard," she said. "And sometimes, they forget to hear anything else." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. No one laughed this time. One of the guests shifted in his seat, clearing his throat quietly. The gray-haired man nodded once, almost to himself. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the wine in his glass before lifting back to her. There was no defensiveness in his expression. Just recognition. "Fair," he said after a moment. Sophie inclined her head slightly. "Is there anything else I can bring for the table?" she asked, her tone returning to its professional calm, as if the conversation had not just peeled back something deeper than anyone had expected. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head once. "No," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Thank you." It was a small thing. 2 words. But they felt different coming from him now. Sophie nodded again, then turned and walked away, her step steady, her posture unchanged. But this time, as she moved through the room, a few heads turned. Not because of what she was wearing. Not because of what she carried. But because of what she had revealed without ever trying to prove anything at all. Back at the table, the conversation slowly resumed, but it was no longer the same. The energy had shifted, quieter, more measured. Ethan picked up his glass again, taking a slow sip, his eyes drifting once more toward the service station where Sophie had returned. He watched as she opened her notebook briefly, jotting something down with quick, precise movements before closing it again. "Interesting," the gray-haired man said, breaking the silence beside him. Ethan did not look away. "Yeah," he replied quietly. But this time, the word carried something heavier. Not dismissal. Not control. Something closer to intrigue. And somewhere beneath that, the first hint of something he had not planned for at all. The rest of the evening unfolded with a quiet tension that no one openly acknowledged, but everyone felt. Conversations resumed, deals were discussed, numbers were mentioned, but the rhythm had changed. It was more careful now, more aware. And at the center of it, whether anyone admitted it or not, was the absence of something that had once been taken for granted. Assumption. Ethan found himself only half listening to the man across from him explaining projections and quarterly forecasts. His attention drifted, not out of boredom, but because something else had taken hold of his focus. Every so often, his eyes moved back toward the service area, almost unconsciously, as if checking whether she was still there. Sophie moved through the room with the same steady pace, the same composed presence, but now there was a subtle difference in how others responded to her. A glance held a second longer. A tone softened slightly. Recognition, even if unnamed, had begun to ripple outward. At one point, she paused near a neighboring table, answering a question in Spanish so fluidly that the guests there exchanged surprised smiles. She did not linger. She simply nodded and moved on, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. He set his glass down slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table, thoughtful again. "You are distracted," one of his partners observed quietly. Ethan did not deny it. "I am, reconsidering something," he said. "Or someone," the gray-haired man added, his tone light but perceptive. Ethan gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "Maybe both." The conversation shifted again, but now it was Ethan asking questions that had nothing to do with business. "How long has she been working here?" he asked a passing server. "A few months," the man replied. "Keeps to herself mostly. Always reading something on her break." Ethan nodded, filing the detail away without fully understanding why it mattered. But it did. It mattered more than the numbers on the table in front of him, more than the deal he had spent weeks preparing for. Because for the first time in a long time, something had disrupted his certainty. Later, as dessert menus were passed around, Sophie returned once more, her presence calm, unchanged. "Would anyone like to see the dessert selection?" she asked. Her voice carried evenly, professional, but there was a quiet strength beneath it now that had not been there earlier, or perhaps had simply not been noticed. Ethan looked up at her again, this time without any trace of condescension. "What would you recommend?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it held something different now. Not a test. Not a trap. An invitation. Sophie considered for a moment, her eyes scanning the table briefly before settling back on him. "If you prefer something light, the lemon tart is balanced," she said. "But if you want something memorable, the chocolate soufflé takes longer, but it is worth the wait." Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. "Memorable," he repeated quietly. "I will take that." A few others followed his lead, ordering the same without much thought. Sophie nodded, making a quick note, then turned to leave again. But as she stepped away, Ethan spoke once more. "Sophie." It was the first time he had used her name. She paused, turning back slightly, her expression attentive. "Yes." "What are you really doing here?" he asked. The question hung in the air, unexpected, too direct to ignore. Around the table, the others fell silent again, sensing the shift. Sophie did not answer right away. Her eyes held his, steady, unreadable for a moment that stretched just long enough to feel intentional. Then, slowly, she gave a small, almost knowing smile. "Working," she said. It was a simple answer. But it was not the full truth. And they both knew it. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her as if trying to read between the lines, to understand something that refused to be explained so easily. For the first time that night, he did not push further. He simply nodded once. "Right," he said. Sophie inclined her head, then walked away again, disappearing briefly into the soft glow of the kitchen doors. And as she did, Ethan realized something he had not expected when he first sat down that evening. This was no longer about a mistake. Or a misunderstanding. It was about a question he could not ignore anymore. And the unsettling realization that the answer might change more than just how he saw her. It might change how he saw everything. The kitchen doors swung open with a soft push, releasing a brief wave of heat and the muted chaos of clinking pans and quiet urgency, but Sophie stepped through it like she belonged to both worlds, the polished calm of the dining room and the controlled rhythm behind the scenes. She placed the dessert order down with a steady hand, then paused for just a second longer than necessary, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter as if grounding herself before moving again. Out in the dining room, Ethan remained seated, but his posture had shifted. He was no longer leaning back in detached control. He was forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, his attention anchored somewhere beyond the conversation still attempting to carry on around him. "You are still thinking about her," the gray-haired man said quietly, not accusing, just observing. Ethan did not deny it this time. "She does not fit," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "Into what?" the man asked. Ethan hesitated, searching for an answer that suddenly felt less certain than it should have been. "Into the role everyone gave her the moment she walked up to the table," he replied. The man nodded slowly, a faint smile forming. "Then perhaps the role is wrong," he said. The word settled into Ethan's thoughts more deeply than expected. Across the room, Sophie re-emerged, carrying a tray with practiced ease. The chocolate soufflés had begun their careful rise, timed precisely, demanding patience. Just like everything else that mattered. She moved from table to table, delivering small moments of satisfaction without drawing attention to herself. But attention followed her now anyway. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just enough to be felt. When she returned to Ethan's table, the desserts were placed one by one, each movement measured, each detail exact. The rich scent of chocolate filled the space, warm and inviting. "Careful," she said softly, "it is delicate." Ethan looked at the dessert, then back at her. "So you said," he replied. There was something different in his tone now. Something almost reflective. Sophie gave a small nod, then began to step away again. But this time, he spoke before she could leave. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked. She paused. Turned. "Of what?" "Of people deciding who you are before you say a word," he said. The table fell quiet again, but this silence was different from before. It was not tension. It was attention. Sophie studied him for a moment, as if weighing the question against something deeper than the words themselves. "No," she said finally. Because they are not deciding who I am. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. They are deciding who they are. The words landed softly, but they carried a clarity that did not need volume. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, and something in his expression shifted again. Not just curiosity now. Not just intrigue. Recognition. And what did I decide? He asked quietly. Sophie held his gaze for a second longer, then gave the smallest hint of a smile. Not mocking. Not dismissive. Just honest. You are still deciding, she said. Then she turned and walked away. Ethan did not stop her this time. He did not need to. Because for the first time that night, he understood something he had not expected to learn in a place like this. This was not a game he controlled. Not a room he owned. And not a person he could define. He picked up his spoon, breaking into the soufflé slowly, watching it sink just slightly under the pressure, then rise again at the edges. Delicate, just like she said. Across the table, no one spoke for a moment. Then the gray-haired man smiled faintly. Memorable, he said. Ethan nodded once, his eyes drifting again toward the space where Sophie had disappeared. Yeah, he said quietly. But this time, the word carried something far more dangerous than certainty. It carried interest. And interest, he realized, had a way of becoming something else entirely when it was not ignored. The check arrived quietly, placed at the edge of the table with the same precision Sophie had carried all night, but this time, Ethan noticed the small detail most people would have missed. The leather folder was aligned perfectly with the edge of his glass, not too close, not too far, as if even that distance had been considered. He rested his fingers on it but did not open it immediately. Around him, chairs shifted slightly as his partners began to gather their things, their conversations soft, polite, already moving on to the next meeting, the next deal, the next version of the same night repeated somewhere else. But Ethan did not move. His attention stayed where it had been for the past hour, drawn back again and again to something he could not categorize, could not simplify. You are staying, the gray-haired man asked, standing now, adjusting his jacket. Ethan gave a small nod. I will join you later, he said. The man studied him for a moment, then smiled knowingly. Some conversations are worth finishing, he said before turning to leave. The table emptied gradually, leaving behind the quiet hum of the restaurant and the faint clink of distant glasses. Ethan finally opened the folder, glanced at the total without really seeing it, then placed his card inside. When Sophie returned to collect it, her movements were as composed as ever, but there was a subtle awareness in her eyes now, as if she already knew he had not stayed by accident. Thank you, she said, reaching for the folder. Ethan did not let go immediately. Not forcefully, just enough to pause the moment. Do you always stay this late? He asked. Sophie looked at him, then at the nearly empty dining room. Most nights, she said. Someone has to. There was no complaint in her tone. Just fact. Ethan nodded slowly, then released the folder. And after, he asked. Sophie tilted her head slightly. After what? After here, he clarified. When you are not working. The question lingered longer than expected, not because it was inappropriate, but because it crossed a line most people did not think to cross. Sophie considered him for a moment, then answered with the same quiet honesty she had carried all night. I go home, she said. I read. I study. Sometimes I sleep. There was a faint hint of humor in the last word, subtle but real. Ethan exhaled softly, almost amused. You make it sound simple. Sophie gave a small shrug. It is simple, she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, that does not mean it is easy. The words settled between them, heavier than their simplicity suggested. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her again, but this time without trying to solve her. What are you studying? He asked. Sophie hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then answered. Languages, she said. Among other things. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly. 5 of them, he asked. Sophie's lips curved into the faintest smile. More than that, she said quietly. He let out a small breath, something between disbelief and admiration. And you are, here, he said, gesturing lightly to the room around them. Sophie followed the gesture, her eyes moving across the emptying tables, the polished surfaces, the fading glow of the evening. "For now," she said. The phrase lingered. Not permanent. Not defined. Just a moment in something larger. Ethan nodded slowly, as if that answer made more sense than anything else she had said. "For now," he repeated. A silence followed, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was steady. Intentional. The kind of silence that did not need to be filled. Somewhere in the background, a chair was stacked, a light dimmed slightly, the night beginning to close in around the edges of the room. Sophie picked up the folder again, this time without interruption. "I will be right back," she said. Ethan watched her walk away, his expression thoughtful, but softer now, less guarded. When she returned, she placed the receipt neatly in front of him, along with a pen. He signed it without hesitation, then paused, the pen still in his hand. For a moment, he seemed to consider something, weighing it carefully. Then he wrote something else beneath his signature. Not a number. Not a figure. A line. When he slid the folder back toward her, Sophie glanced down briefly, just enough to read it. Her expression did not change immediately. But something shifted behind her eyes, something small but unmistakable. She looked back up at him. "You are still deciding," she said softly, echoing her earlier words. Ethan met her gaze, this time without any distance left between them. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just realized I was asking the wrong questions." Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Not agreement. Not rejection. Just recognition. And in that quiet exchange, something new began to take shape, not loud, not certain, but real enough to matter. The restaurant had nearly emptied by the time Ethan finally stood, the soft golden lighting dimmed just enough to signal the end of the night, but not quite enough to erase what had happened within it. Chairs were neatly aligned, tables reset with quiet efficiency, and the air carried that faint, lingering warmth of a place that had hosted more than just conversation. Ethan adjusted his jacket slowly, his movements unhurried, as if leaving too quickly would break something he had not fully understood yet. Near the service station, Sophie was finishing her closing routine, stacking menus, checking receipts, her focus steady but not rushed. She moved with the same quiet control he had noticed from the beginning, but now it felt different. Not distant. Not unreachable. Just, intentional. He took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance that had defined most of the evening. Sophie noticed him before he spoke, her gaze lifting from the counter, calm as ever. "We are closing," she said gently, not dismissive, just matter of fact. Ethan gave a small nod. "I figured," he replied. There was a pause, brief but meaningful, as if both of them understood this moment did not belong to the same structure as the rest of the night. "You wrote something on the receipt," she said, her tone neutral but direct. Ethan glanced down for a moment, then back at her. "I did." "You usually do that?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Not usually." Sophie studied him for a second, then reached into her apron and pulled out the folded receipt, holding it lightly between her fingers. "Then why tonight?" she asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the now empty tables before returning to her. "Because I realized something," he said. "And I was not sure I would get another chance to say it." Sophie did not interrupt. She simply waited. Ethan hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because he was choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. "I spend most of my time in rooms where people try to impress me," he said. "Or agree with me. Or prove something to me." His voice softened slightly. "You did none of that." Sophie's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened, subtle but present. "You just were," he continued. And somehow that said more than anything else in the room. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that did not need explanation. Sophie glanced down at the receipt again, then back up at him. "You called me illiterate," she said quietly. Not accusing. Not emotional. Just factual. Ethan nodded once, the weight of it clear in his expression. "I did," he admitted. "And I was wrong." There was no hesitation in the apology. No defense. No justification. Just truth. Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring something deeper than the words themselves. Most people would have said sorry earlier, she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost self-aware smile. Most people would not have needed this long to understand they were wrong, he replied. A small pause followed, then Sophie folded the receipt again, more slowly this time, as if the gesture itself mattered. And now that you understand, she asked. Ethan did not look away. Now I would like to ask a different question, he said. Sophie tilted her head slightly. What kind? Ethan's expression softened, just slightly, but enough to shift the moment. Not about what you are doing here, he said. But what you actually want. The question lingered between them, heavier than anything he had asked before. Sophie did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved briefly toward the door, where the outside world waited, quiet and distant, then back to him. That is not a question you ask someone at the end of a shift, she said. Ethan nodded. Probably not, he admitted. But I am asking anyway. Sophie studied him, longer this time, as if deciding whether this moment was worth stepping into. Then, slowly, she spoke. I want something that does not depend on who is sitting at the table, she said. Something that does not change based on who is watching. Ethan listened, his expression steady, absorbing every word. And you? She asked, turning the question back to him. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, then answered with an honesty that felt unfamiliar even to him. I thought I already had everything I wanted, he said. Tonight made me realize I might not even know what that is. Sophie held his gaze, and for the first time, there was something softer in her expression. Not agreement. Not certainty. But possibility. And in that quiet, almost fragile space between them, the night did not feel like it was ending at all. It felt like something else had just begun. The night air felt colder now, not because the temperature had changed, but because Sophie had stopped holding everything in. She stood under the streetlight, the soft glow tracing the tension in her face, the quiet strength she had carried all evening finally beginning to crack at the edges. Ethan noticed it immediately. Not as something dramatic. Not as a scene. Just a shift. A real one. Sophie let out a breath that trembled slightly before she steadied it, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. You know what people do not understand, she said, her voice lower now, less controlled. Ethan did not answer. He just listened. Sophie shook her head faintly, a small, tired smile flickering and fading just as quickly. It is not about one comment, she said. It is never just one. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time, there was no shield in them. It is every look, every assumption, every time you are reduced to something smaller because it is easier for them. The words did not rush. They came slowly, like something she had carried for too long. And you learn to stand there and take it, she continued. Because reacting costs more than staying quiet. Ethan felt the weight of that land deeper than anything she had said before. Not because it was loud. But because it was true. Sophie exhaled again, her shoulders lowering slightly as if the effort of holding everything together had finally slipped. I am just tired of being underestimated before I even speak, she admitted. The vulnerability in her voice was quiet, but unmistakable. And it changed everything. Ethan stepped closer, slower this time, careful, aware. He did not interrupt her. He did not try to explain. Instead, he reached up and removed his jacket, the movement deliberate, grounded. Sophie watched him, confusion flickering briefly across her face. He held the jacket out to her, not insisting, not pushing. Just offering. You should not have had to carry that alone tonight, he said quietly. Sophie let out a small breath, shaking her head faintly. You cannot fix that with a gesture, she replied. Ethan nodded once, accepting it. I know, he said. This is not me trying to fix it. He held her gaze, steady, honest. This is me choosing to do something different than I did before. The words settled between them, simple, but anchored in action. Not empty. Not performative. Sophie studied him for a long moment, searching, measuring, as if expecting the version of him from earlier to still be there. But he was not. Not in this moment. Slowly, she reached out and took the jacket, her fingers brushing against his briefly before she pulled it around her shoulders. It was not about warmth. It was about what it meant. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different now. Softer. Sophie looked at him again, her expression no longer guarded, but not fully open either. Just real. Why did you stay? She asked quietly. Ethan did not hesitate this time. Because walking away would have been easier, he said. And I do not think easy is what I need anymore. Sophie held his gaze, something shifting again, something small but important. She nodded once, as if accepting that answer for now. Then do not stop here, she said. It was not a challenge. It was a boundary. Ethan nodded. I will not, he said. And this time, it sounded like a decision, not a possibility. Sophie adjusted the jacket slightly, then turned toward the street, her steps slower now, more grounded. She did not look back when she spoke. Walk with me, she said. Ethan did not hesitate. He moved beside her, matching her pace without trying to lead. And for the first time that night, it did not feel like two separate worlds colliding. It felt like something new being built, one step at a time, without assumptions, without roles, just choice. And that was where it truly began. The bookstore felt warmer than before, not because the lights had changed, but because something between them had. Sophie moved slowly along the shelf, her fingers brushing the spines without really seeing them this time, her thoughts closer to the question she had just asked. Ethan did not follow right away. He stayed where he was for a brief beat, watching her, not with curiosity now, but with intention. Then he turned slightly, his gaze landing on the small table near the entrance where a few books were stacked unevenly, one of them worn at the edges, its pages marked, "Lived in." He picked it up carefully, glancing at the handwritten notes along the margins. Not polished. Not perfect. Real. He turned the book once in his hands, then walked back toward her. Sophie sensed him before she saw him, her movement slowing as she turned. Ethan held the book out, not to impress, just to offer. You said you look for things that help you ask better questions, he said. Sophie glanced down, recognizing it instantly. Her fingers paused, then closed around it. This one does, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Then I should probably start there. Sophie looked at him more carefully now, not just at what he was doing, but how he was doing it. No performance. No control. Just showing up. She let out a small breath, softer this time, then opened the book to a blank page near the front. She reached for the pen behind her ear, paused, and looked up at him. If you are going to start here, do not start by reading, she said. Ethan tilted his head. Then how? Sophie turned the book toward him, tapping the empty page. By answering. He almost smiled. He took the pen from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the page. This time, he did not rush. He wrote one line. Then he turned the book back to her. Sophie read it. Once. Then again. Her breath caught, barely visible, but there. The room seemed to narrow for a second, the noise fading into the background. The line was simple. Honest. I stayed because you did not need me to, and I wanted to anyway. Sophie did not speak immediately. Her thumb traced the edge of the page, grounding herself. When she looked up, her eyes held his longer than before. Not testing. Not guarded. Just, there. That is a better answer, she said, softer now. Ethan gave a small nod. I am learning. Sophie closed the book gently, holding it against her chest for a second as if steadying something inside her. Then she stepped closer, just enough to change the distance between them. You know this does not fix everything, she said. Ethan nodded. I know. And I am not someone who changes direction because of one night. I would not expect you to. No pressure. No rush. Sophie studied him again, searching for doubt, for ego. She did not find it. The corner of her lips lifted, warmer now. Good. A quiet pause followed. This time it felt grounded. Ethan glanced at the shelves, then back at her. So what happens next? Sophie tilted her head, considering him, then the book in her hands. Next, she said slowly, you keep showing up. Ethan nodded once. He understood. Not tonight. Not just this moment. Consistency. I can do that. Sophie held his gaze, then turned and placed the book back on the table, but slightly forward, where it could not be missed. Intentional. She glanced back at him, her expression open enough to matter. Then we will see where that leads. Ethan stepped closer, not to close the distance completely, but to stand within it without hesitation. And for the first time that night, neither of them felt the need to prove anything. What had started with judgment had become something harder to earn. Not attention. Not validation. Something real. Sophie picked the book up again, this time pressing it lightly into his hands instead of setting it down. Her voice dropped just enough to make the moment land. Do not just stay, she said. Choose me, the same way you chose to stay.